Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another session of the Cycle 25 Gathering of the Tribe. This is a chance to get us all back together. And this morning, I am super lucky because I have Mr. Frank Howell with us from the ICQ podcast and other locales to give a wonderful talk. I think something you'll really enjoy. I've had a quick look at the slides myself, and I'll be driving slides for him. But we've had a quick look at this, and I think it's a topic that both contesters and all of us will enjoy in terms of price performance and satisfaction in driving HF transceiver sales. So I will let him do a much better introduction than I can, but Frank, welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rod. It's really a pleasure to be invited to speak to any group. Having been a speaker in academic circles for, I guess decades, it's always wonderful for people to devote their time to listen to something you might have to say. And I hope that some of this will be of interest to you. I think anybody who has HF privileges is struggle with buying a rig. So brief background, my PhD is in sociology and statistics with a minor in computer science. I've been involved in technology, interested since I was 8 years old. Life and no Elmer and growing up in poverty meant I didn't get a eHam license, but I was a shortwave listener, building crystal sets and doing the kind of things that membership in the International Radio Club of America by mail would lead someone in middle Georgia to do. So I was 58 when I first got licensed. And so I've been around. I built 2 broadcast stations in Milledgeville, Georgia by the time I was 20. It's just wonderful using other people's money to do really neat things. And so I went into graduate school, became a college professor, and just got licensed when I retired from Mississippi State and went over to the chancellor's office in Atlanta, Georgia, to be a senior policy advisor and being basically a data gunslinger. I was that permanent record your teacher threatened you with, I'm going to put this on your permanent record. Well, in my elevator speech to someone says, well, what do you do over there? I said, remember that permanent record? I have it and I'm looking at it. And so I basically was in charge of all the data in the 35 campus system. I retired from that and we moved back to Starkville, famous for MFJ Enterprises, and secondarily Mississippi State University. In the ham world, at least. And we moved down to the Jackson, Mississippi area and live on the banks of the Barnett Reservoir. And I became editor-in-chief at Springer Media in the Netherlands, the largest scientific publisher in the world. So I've done a number of things. My wife says I just can't keep a steady job that long. I've done different things. So enough about me. That's a little bit about my background. I've been a practicing statistician. I've been an investigative journalist with the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and a number of Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a number of other outlets involving data journalism. So one of those data nerds and that kind of thing. So with that in mind, I've tried to look at what of my skill sets can I bring to amateur radio, a hobby that I loved, but literally waited 50 years to get engaged in. And so this is simply one of them. And as I bought several HF rigs and struggled with that and thinking about that process, about 6 months ago, I said, we ought to be able to look at this in a more consistent and coherent way. And I had been a customer of Rob Sherwood. I bought a JRC NRD 545 receiver from him, 10 years ago or some period. And he did a little mod for me. And I had interacted with him as an SWL when he wrote for Passport to World Band Radio, Larry Magny's publication that has since gone out of business. So I've known Rob and have tremendous respect for him. So my talk today is, does price buy performance or satisfaction in an HF transceiver? Next slide.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to be slow on this.
That's all right.
There we go. Okay.
There are a number of cultural themes. Money can't buy me love from the Beatles, can't get no satisfaction from the Stones, and then the ever popular mantra that we all hear, you get what you pay for. Steve Ford put in a little pamphlet that the ARL publishes. You finally got some money. You want to make the right choice. You talk to any veteran ham, and he or she can let out some blue language about a rig they spent good money on, and it just didn't do. It was a dog. Now, nobody wants to throw away money, but how do you know which one is best? There isn't a single answer to that. Best is a loaded term. It's a complicated term. It's a many splendored thing term because people define that differently. And I'll get into some of that here. But does the logic of this work in purchasing an HF receiver? Does price make the driving distance? Now, ARL, RSGB, they don't really recommend transceivers. Rob Sherwood's published a table of his suite of bench tests for receiving. He's recently talked about quality of transmitting in a QST article. But Rob and the lab have, and perhaps Adam Farson, maybe third there, the Avis of bench test engineers for this wonderful website. You're not familiar with Adam's work, particularly for SDRs. So eHam has become a very popular website for their reviews, and you can wave your arms, they're rubbish, whatever. Here's the deal. They come from people that say they have the rig for the most part. They give a consistent rating. There's no other source I've found that gives a consistent rating from 1 to 5. We call that a Likert scale in the social sciences. And people tell you a little bit, sometimes good radio or terrible radio, but most go in for what sometimes can be pages of narrative about why they gave it a rating and what they think. It's the only consistent data source. And here's what makes it important beyond that. People act on it. I know you have listened to other hams. Perhaps you may not be willing to admit it on the video today, but you too have read it. You too have looked up things on it. I'm always reminded by the people who say, I never watch TV. I only watch public broadcasting. And then they know all about the favorite shows. It's a little like that. Next slide. So eHam is a force, and it's our only set of consumer satisfaction. All right, so does price buy performance or satisfaction? So you've got multiple and somewhat complicated options when you enter this thing. You can ask fellow hams what they like and what to stay away from. If you remember the Life cereal, I saw George he was eating something, I think a pastry. If you think about cereals, Life cereal used to be very popular, and there used to be a commercial where these two young boys had a younger brother in a high chair named Mikey. And, they used to say, hey, give it to Mikey. See this Mikey, if Mikey likes it. Hey, Mikey likes it. So we do that very often. We see if Mikey likes the new IC 7300 and so on. Or you can go through the latest bench test ratings. You can look at QST. You can look at RSGB. They have some very fine technical reviews there. You can look at Rob Sherwood thing, and you can try to see what's best on the workbench. Like most laboratory experiments involving people, the thing about that is while the receiver may work the same outside the lab that it does in the lab, people tend to not behave the same way outside of a laboratory as they do inside. So the flip side of that is that a rig may have a wonderful bench rating, but you may not like it. You may think the audio sounds poorly. You may think this, that, or the other. So, but a bench rating is an objective, rational assessment of certain characteristics. I think that's undeniable. So you can go through eHam and try to figure out that. I promise you, if there is a wonderful review today, tomorrow somebody will weigh in with, it's a dog, it's terrible. I don't care what they say. You're going to have this duplicity of opinion. So what the heck are you going to do? What we sometimes wind up doing, just say, I don't know what to do. Here, take my money. I just want a good rig. And that's where we have to come to the issue of how much does price matter? If you drop a load of cash on a radio, does that guarantee that it's going to be a good performing rig? A little bit like a dog chasing its tail exercise, but it's not the sources that are the problem, in my opinion. It's putting them together in a coherent way. Go ahead, next slide, and I'll set this up. So how do we do that? Well, it occurred to me that what we're dealing with as hams is you've got the aggregate rating on eHam. You've got a QST or Rob Sherwood or Adam Farson or someone else's kind of bench review. And then you kind of look at, gee, what does this thing cost? And you got these aggregate things. Now, you might be the kind of person who would take notes, kind of like Sheldon Cooper on Big Bang Theory. You know, you sit down, you write all this down, and you make your own data set. Well, I did that. I said, you know, the problem is we don't have this data at the rig level. The rig is the unit of analysis, and it's what we're focusing on. So I made basically a big spreadsheet. I put it in another program, and I took the satisfaction ratings, the average rating off eHam. I put all the Sherwood's stuff out of his, and we're going to look at that in just a second. And then I looked up the price. That took the longest period of time. Now, I went with Rob Sherwood's ratings. They're kind of, in my opinion, the holy grail for rig evaluations on the workbench as far as receive is concerned. And there are a few reasons. He's independent. He doesn't take any advertising money. Yeah, he'd sell you a radio back in the day if he resold them, and he did one of his mods on it. And he built a wonderful filter system for one of the Drake rigs. That's how he got into testing them. And yeah, he had a little bit of a business, and his engineering services were certainly there. And he worked at for KOA and some of the other, but that's pro forma. Yeah. But he doesn't take money for his stuff. He won't even take a rig from a manufacturer. Go back
I'm
a
sorry.
little bit there. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Now, there you go. And he'll also speak his mind. Now, he differs with the ARL in a very friendly and professional way on some issues. That's typical in science. There's not there's a way to measure something, and you may say, yeah, but that particular protocol doesn't capture something that's new in the design. Adam Farson, for example, has come in with a whole different approach in some ways about SDRs. That is typical traditional science. So I picked his because I feel like he's sort of independent. Now, I've used this at the rig level to look at price, performance, and satisfaction for individual rigs. Now, to my knowledge, please tell me if I've missed something. It's the first time that anybody has reported anything like this, as far as I can tell. Next slide. So I want to go through what I've done and what I haven't done. I don't want to bore you, but I want to focus on that because it'll help answer some questions in your minds. Now, I'm using the word rig. Mostly, predominantly, they are transceivers. A few of them are just receivers. Sherwood started out with the Drake R4C because his experience with it was very different from what the workbench test by the ARRL said. Now, the year that his rigs and his table were released, if you go back and look at that, it covers a 50-year period. Now, that's not every rig out there, but I can't think of any major or highly popular transceivers that are not listed. If you can pop me an email, I'd love to see. Now, a few of the rigs in Sherwood's table weren't reviewed on eHam. They tend to be older ones. Now, I just had to take them out of the analysis because it didn't have one main vector. A couple of his rigs, if you'll study his table, they had second measurements. Now, that was due to a key upgrade or some other mod, and you can read that. Now, this does not mean a rig such as the Kenwood TS590S and the SG. Now, that's a completely different rig, and they are both in the analysis. So he didn't add, a new model number. That's a separate deal. Some had some minor tweaks. And so I kept those out because not every manufacturer, not every rig had that same opportunity. So to keep it consistent, I took that that approach. And believe me, when you get in here, averaging the multiple measurements and doing all that stuff really um, uh, is an illusion. It doesn't really catch. So the first stock rig was what I used. A total of 126 rigs were used in the study. Next slide. Now let's talk about the measurements. Here's one you might disagree with me on, but let me tell you why. Price is what the manufacturer says is the product value to the marketplace. It's not what you can pick up a given rig for at Ham Radio Outlet, at MTC Main Trading in Texas, from your third cousin who is a silent key, and you can buy it from the estate. It's not any of those pure retail outlet metrics because they go all over the place. This is what used to be called the manufacturer's suggested retail price at the moment of entry into the marketplace. It's what the manufacturer signals to the product. Now, I had an interesting conversation about this with Mark Wilson at QST, who puts that in. Well, that's not what people can buy it for. And he kind of gave me this argument about, no, you got to go look at all of them. I said, well, Mark, why do you publish that price in QST? Well, it took about 3 days of dead silence, and he finally came back and he says, well, okay, I understand your point. So I'm looking at it from the economist's point of view. What is the product value placed upon it? Your mileage may vary at the purely retail end. Now, most price data, and this took me the longest period of time, I came from ARL's QST magazine when it was announced. Some of the vintage rigs, I went back through manufacturers' catalogs. Yes, many of them are online, even in the Wayback Machine. Collins, you can go back and look up some of their stuff. Drake, you can go back and look up some of their stuff. Hallicrafters. And so the year of release, I got what the manufacturer said the suggested retail price was. I've got a pretty good digital collection of CQ, Ham Radio Magazine, Monitoring Times, and a number of others, some websites like Rig Pick and some things like that. The dollar values over this 50-year period of time changed substantially, as we all know. So I transformed the price data into 2019 US dollar values using the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index, fairly pro forma, a lot of things online. If you're in the United Kingdom, you can take the exchange rate from USD to British GBP and convert that and take all the price numbers and what I've got and convert them over to that in British pounds. However, I do not know if the equivalent of a CPI in the United Kingdom would be the same. So, your mileage may vary there. All right, that's under the hood. That's what I did on price. You may disagree. That's fine. But this is the value the manufacturer puts it to the marketplace. And it's very consistent with what a lot of Nobel laureate economists at University of Chicago say is kind of the best thing to look at the study of price and its relationships to other features of a product. Okay, next slide. Let's look at price. Now, I took this in 2019 dollars, and on the right there, you'll see a histogram. And what you can see is over a 50-year period for all of the rigs in Rob's table, it's about $4,200 is the average, but that doesn't tell you what's typical. The median is about $3,100. And you look at the thing is like a lot of price data, you get some that cost a lot. In your mind, can you think of what's out there on that right tail? Art Collins built a very nice radio. So we're going to get to that. So a $3,000 price tag kind of helps you identify about what the median value of all the rigs in Rob Sherwood's table cost expressed with inflation control. Next slide. Let's look at performance. If you don't follow Rob Sherwood's tables and study his footnotes and look at his documentation and that sort of thing, in a moment of shameless promotion of the ICQ podcast, If you look at my interview with Rob or listen to it in episode 305, you'll learn an awful lot about how he approaches this. Some do's and don'ts, some issues, and that sort of thing. And if you'll follow up and listen to my interview with Bob Allison of the ARL Test Lab in episode 312, you'll hear a bit about where they differ. They're friends. They communicate a lot. Probably the best of what you would hope for in a friendly competition to do measurements well, consistent, and it be informative. Rob differs a bit. I really encourage you to focus on that if you do take the time to use his data. Now, if you look at his table, and I know you've probably talked with people and saying, hey, Yesu got the FTDX 101 and it's number one on the Sherwood table. It reminds me of Dick Clark and the number one rock and roll song that came out. But, you know, even back in Dick Clark's day, they had two ratings. One of them was, can you dance to it? I forget what the first one was. Now, Rob has multiple measurements. He ranks his table on one criterion, narrow space dynamic range in dB. Now, his rationale for this is he's very open about it. After years of testing, some 40 some odd years, it's the single best criterion for the CW contest operator, which he is, and he's a very good one. And he got a good contest station outside of town out in Colorado, and I got no doubt about him. I revere Rob Sherwood. He tells me something on bench test of RF and radios. I'm probably going to take it to the bank unless I'm shown different. However, not every ham is a CW contester. And so you may think another aspect is important. So we could just redo the analysis with each one of his indicators. Let's go to him and look at them in the next slide. If you look at his indicators, you know, you've got a number of them. Well, why does he measure those? Well, he thinks they're all important. And they are. Now, his preference, nothing wrong with it, his preference is narrow space dynamic range. And he tells you why. Not deceptive whatsoever, telling you exactly why he does it. Now, I want to point something out here about this. We all go to restaurants, or we did before the pandemic. Sometimes in a restaurant, you have a fixed menu option. But often in a restaurant, you can order a la carte. If you're across the pond over there, if you order fish and chips, you can say, no chips. I want to substitute something. We don't get to do that much with radios. If you look at this, we don't get to say, hey, I want this noise floor. I want this close in dynamic range. And I want something a little more sensitive. And the selectivity, well, okay, we don't get to do that. What we have in a rig is an engineering design that goes through price filters to determine products and that they can get to build this thing and build this out and get a price target that they work with. And we might get an option. You know, you might get an optional filter, you might that, but we don't get to sort of do a la carte ordering. So what we have on the bench in Rob's tables is the realized performance of a rig. That is, here's this rig, and here's what we observe about it along these dimensions. So if we replicated everything, if I replicated the analysis for every one of those, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, a bunch of different results. And I can tell you this, as a statistician, they won't all be the same. Remember that point of frustration where I said, just give me a good rig. So I thought, you know, in the engineering of this, if a rig has a good close-in dynamic range, I wonder if it has good filtering too. I wonder if it has good sensitivity. I wonder if it has a lot of these other measurements that are good. And in fact, it does. And I created what I'm calling, to honor Rob, the Sherwood Performance Index. That's not his doing, that's my doing. So if there's anything wrong with it, it's on me, not Rob. to the single index of received performance. And let me show you how that works. If you go next slide. In propagation measurements back in the 40s or 50s, principal components analysis has been used to simplify some data, to smooth some data. It's been used in tests of Army soldiers when Ray Cattell developed it back in the 30s. So it's a very well-oiled machine. It's kind of the digital multimeter of statistical science. It's there, it works, it does what it does. So if you take a look at all of these measurements and you look on this pattern matrix, and Rod, if you can kind of put your mouse up there, your cursor where the loading column is, see where it says loading on the pattern up at the top left, pattern matrix.
Pattern matrix loading.
Loading, that second column left of commute.
There we go.
Loading.
Got it.
Now, notice that narrow dynamic range. These coefficients range from 0 to 1 positively or negatively, because they can have a kind of like a phase, Notice that his favorite criterion has the second largest loading. That is, what do they have in common together? So the dynamic range has a 0.83. The filtering at the ultimate dB that he measures, third from the bottom, 0.843. So if you go through that, and as he points out, noise floor tends to not be that much of a problem anymore, and sensitivity is less of a problem. And if you look at it, those loadings come out very similar to how Rob Sherwood talks about his bench measurement. He and I had a lot of communication over about a month's period. I wanted to make sure that I was not missing something. And if you look at that scree plot, now I've got part one of a two-part article, severely edited, mind you, in the National Contesting Journal. 3 times I had to get Rick Lindquist to take screen plot out of it. No, Rick, it's scree plot. Scree is that stuff that you'll geologists say winds up at the bottom of a hill. Those of you who go out and hike, you got these little pebbles and rocks at the bottom of a hill. I put a red line in there. How many of these components seem to adequately describe your input variable? And it's a judgment, but you can see that first one is way up there at the top at about 4. And then it falls down, and then it almost fits that red line. So of all the differences in the bench measurements across these 126 rigs, 40% of them are held in common. And so a single index of all of Rob's bench measurements is what I extracted and what I used. That second one that's down there just above that line, it reflects a little more of selectivity. And I've actually analyzed it, and it doesn't do anything that dominant one does. You're going to find out that my results are very consistent with using Rob's rankings, although there are some differences, and I think they may be important. So the Sherwood Performance Index, go to the next slide, is a single composite measure of all of his bench measurements across 126 rigs. Now, it has no real world metric like dollars, years, volts, that kind of thing. It's a little bit like reactance in the sense that it's a phenomenon, and how you measure it, it doesn't have a natural metric. So it's a Z-score, for those of you who are familiar with statistics at all, with a standardized score. A Z-score has a mean of 0 and standard deviation of 1. Well, that can get complicated to explain to people. And so I did a T-score transformation, adding 100 to each number. Everyone got the same 100, and multiplying it by 15. Now, remember the old IQ test where the average is 100 and the standard deviation is 15? That's how they got that. And so a 100 on the Sherwood Performance Index means that you were at the mean and the median, within rounding error, of that composite measure on all of Sherwood's bench tests. And here's a histogram of it. And you can see that it's a little lumpy, as we statisticians would say, but it tends to fit more or less for real data, a normal curve. It has the property of symmetry. Before we leave this slide, I want to point something out to you. If you believe that what Rob Sherwood does is useful and that it captures real differences in rigs, some of them differ widely from another. A standard deviation is an important metric in statistics to describe a distribution. If you go 3 standard deviations away from the mean and it's a normal distribution, or if it has a good level of symmetry, then you've got 99% of all the cases. So note that some rigs were down about 60 or just above 60. Let's see, 15 and 15 is 30. 30 from 100 would be 70. So you got some receivers that, boy, they're not very good, are they, relative to the rest of them? But look on the upper tail. Some, now say 15 times 3 would be 45. You've got some that are 3 standard deviations above. Keep this in mind as we go through the results. It's important. Next slide. Now, satisfaction is just the average from the eHam product reviews section. They're rated from 1 the lowest to 5 the highest. Let me wave my arms. It's the cumulative average, which reflects the ratings volunteered by hams, not every purchaser of the rig. Volunteer, cattle call, as I like to do it, crowdsourced as of November 2019. It reflects the complete experience. If you read the narrative, sometimes they're mad at the manufacturer, and it's more about the manufacturer than it is the actual radio. Sometimes it's their reseller. They'll jump up and down about some reseller did them wrong, and they can write a country music song out of it if you read the narrative. I won't tell you. I've read every review for every rig in this study more than once, probably 2 to 3. Some I went back to look at very carefully. What I have in the works is a web scraping exercise with the consent of eHam. I'm scraping all those reviews. I'm going to do it's not artificial intelligence. People call it this. It's actually just natural language processing to do some sentiment scores to find out what are the biggest words associated with specific rigs. Can we guess that bang for the buck will be the one for the IC 7300? I would wager that. So that research is underway and forthcoming. So keep in mind, satisfaction is the cumulative average over the life of the rig's existence in the marketplace, and it's not measured just after release. Now, for some hams, they got it and opened the box and it smelled good and they give it 5. Now, keep that in mind. But when you average them, a lot of those that bounce around all over the place, they tend to settle down. That's kind of one of the things that you'll see in statistics. While I'm web scraping, I'm going to get each individual review, not just for these rigs, but for every product and service in eHam, the entire corpus. And I have some future research that I'm going to model the individual ratings on eHam. And I'll come back to this data set, but I'm going to add the transmit quality that Rob Sherwood talked about in his QST piece here last year or sometime, but taking them from the ARL test lab, because Rob didn't do the transmit stuff, and we could never go back and do it. It's just not feasible. So that's some stuff that I'm going to do. It's in the works. Year or two, I may be back talking about some of that. So let's go to the next slide. How does that look? Well, we have a little bit of a halo effect in that, unlike the price data that was skewed to the high end, well, it is skewed to the high end. This is skewed to the low end. You've almost got to work at it to get a bad review on eHam in the aggregate, not an individual, but in the aggregate. So the median review is 4.7. 4.6 is the mean, standard deviation about 0.2, about 0.3. So you can look at it And I've had some people say, well, wait a minute. You get somebody that gets this rig and they don't like it, and they tell 10 friends, and they tell 10 friends, and they tell 10 friends. And then you got a whole lot of negative reviews. And I went, well, wait a minute. Now let's think about it for a minute. So you ask Mikey if he likes it, and Mikey hates it. Do you buy it and then review it on eHam because Mikey hated it? I'm not sure. There are a few people who have borrowed friends' rigs and said they rated them, but I don't think that fits the data that we observe. If anything, we get a halo effect. So keep that in mind. It's the aggregate, it's the lifetime, and it's really the only consistent rating that we have. So this is the measure of consumer satisfaction. There are better ways to do it. The paper I sent to Rod, if you'll pop him a note or pop me a note, I'll send you that paper. George, I think I sent this to you some months ago, but as busy as you are, you may not have had a chance to look at it. And I got a lot of details in there. So, all right, that's consumer satisfaction, and that's what that looks like. Let's go to the next slide. Well, here's some of the results. So let's look at the top and the bottom rigs. Look, we'll find out the answer. But if we wanted to guarantee that we got the best rig, some of my money's on the floor here, we'd buy what? We'd buy Hilberling. We'd all buy Hilberling. That'd guarantee it. I'm going to convince you, I hope, that is not true. Now, so the top release price was Hilberling. If you put it in 2019 dollars, Collins was expensive then, and it's darn sure expensive in today's dollars. Art Collins built a fine radio. So your mileage may vary on what you can buy them used. But if you look at the release to the marketplace, that old phrase that said, rich hams by Collins, smart hams by Drake. Now, Drake was a marketeer, but nevertheless, you'll see some of that. And let's look at some of the more expensive rigs, the 7851, the 7800, the 990. You put them, you go over and look in today's dollars, and you'll see some of the same things. Let's look at the bottom. The bottom rig, some are receivers like the old Frog 7700. When I got my PhD, I bought myself a Frog 7000 and had a mod put in it from a company called Radio West in Ensenada, I think, as I recall. And great little radio. Got a barn door on the front end. They put an extra filter in for me because of it. So you can kind of look at some of those. And the reason I'm going through this is a little later when we look at performance and satisfaction, there's going to be a picture emerge. Look at the bottom 10 here in today's dollars. That FT891, you can buy it cheaper than that today, of course. But when it's introduced to the market at $891, the Flex 1500, the KX2, the K2, that's what the terrain looks like if you add these price data to it, sort them, look at the top 10, look at the bottom 10. That's what this dish I've done smells like coming out of the oven. Next slide. All right, let's look at the same thing, but for satisfaction performance. Well, we saw the halo effect. Here's the top, just the top 10 ranked. They're all fives. Everybody loved it. Everybody gave them a 5. That Drake R4C, you got some radios here. The Anon 200D, the FTDX 101D, and then you can go through. Note that lonely ICR72. We're going to name and shame that in terms of the performance and satisfaction here a little later, unfortunately. Look at the top rigs. In this composite index, while the FTD 101 was the first 100 dB close-in narrow-range rig that Sherwood measured, when you put all of the measurements together, it's just behind by, six points, the Flex Radio 66M. Third is the 6400. Fourth is the 7851, and so on and so on. And then you look at the bottom one. AOR 5000, Kenwood R2000, and so on. All right, so that's the other three dimensions. It's really important to look at basic descriptive data before you get any fancier. Um, and you see so many people out there today that learned how to run regression or something else in school, and they do that without ever looking at their data. When you look at the individual data, you say, wow, that should have been dealt with and treated before then. So let's go to the next slide. Let's look at the trends over time. So what I've done, if you think about it, Rob's been busy for 40 some odd years. The date of release to the marketplace is about 50 years. So let's look at the trends in price, both nominal price at the point of release, as well as the adjusted price in with inflation control. And you're going to get the same picture, interestingly. The earliest spike was over $20,000 for the Collins rig. But there are two periods where real prices spiked, around 1990 and around 2010. Now, the price of parts and rig production in Japan and in the post-80s recession probably created that spike. It created a similar spike in many other electronic consumer products and other products in general that weren't electronic. But notice the introduction of premium HF rigs. Look at those spikes on the right end. ICOM probably led the way, at least insofar as Sherwood's rigs that he's tested here. So keep those two spikes in mind. One was because of parts shortages and recessionary practices, and the other was kind of the introduction of the premium rig concept. Next slide. Now, this previous slide, the one on performance index, go back. Yeah. I want you to look at this. That red line is the median score on the Sherwood Performance Index. In Rob's QST article on transmission for the Collins rig that he points out in his QST piece on transmitter quality, he said it was the cleanest transmitter he'd ever tested. Well, this is the receive counterpart to that back in the 50s. Note that back in the 50s, it was largely the Collins was right there on the median over a 50-year period. They were as good as the median score over a 50-year period. And you see the performance on his measurements kind of meander through, and I think that's the early 90s, if my eyes are not deceiving me, where it pops up to the median and it's bebopping along. And look at what happened in 2000. It began to realize what happened in the microprocessor industry, the miniaturization of parts, the increased production of parts, and those kind of agglomeration factors that economists point out. Look at what happened in 2010. Here's the punchline. In 2010, there are over 2 standard deviations above the average when you look at the median price or median performance. We have receivers that are the best that we've ever had insofar as Rob's tests are concerned, and it's not even close. I wonder who makes those. I wonder what they cost, because we all want some of those, right? We don't buy the brown bananas at the grocery store. We want the yellow ones that maybe even are organically grown and so on. We all want better performance. Next slide. Now let's look at the eHam satisfaction rating. Rob and I, Sherwood and I went through this a great deal. And there's 2 things you ought to pay attention here. I've got these little funny tan boxes. A very famous statistician that worked for Bell Labs and was a faculty member at Princeton, John Tukey, T-U-K-E-Y, developed the box and whisker diagram. And that tan box with the little black line in the middle of it, That's the median. And then you get a nice little summary of the distribution of the eHam scores for each rig, depending upon which decade they were released to the market. Prior to 1970, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010 and beyond. And there's two things you can see here. The average, the median here, pretty stable. The median eHam review has remained stable for rigs covering virtually 50 years. But there's a heck of a lot of variation within. And that means that people have some winners and people have some losers in their collective minds when you look at the average. That little line is where I look at it for each single year. And you see how it's just jumping around all over the place? Look at that poor forlorn ICOM R72 out there down on the bottom. It's like that little puppy dog that somebody wants to rescue from the pound. And I'm not picking on Ray Novak or ICOM. I'm just pointing out this is what's in the data there. And so there are some that are not loved. And this is maybe the poster child for it. Maybe a great rig. I've never owned one in terms of how you feel about it individually. But this is the pattern of this over time. And note that there are some real winners, even in the 2010s. There's some real losers in the minds of individuals. Now, I often hear hams that have great puzzlement over how come it don't get a good score on eHam if Rob Sherwood says it's good and QST says it's good. These are fundamentally, distinctly different measurements for a given rig. And I'm investigating what's their relationship. Because we all want to know if Mikey likes it, right? We trust some of our friends and what they think. Next slide. Well, if you saw the movie Finding Nemo, finding the optimal rig. Now, these aggregate results are kind of what ham's rank and file have, and how you put them together. It's kind of an impediment to finding the right rig. It's part of why that Steve Ford quote of every ham looking for an HF rig can find an Elmer or somebody else they trust that can tell you, I've dropped 3K or 5K on XYZ rig, and as a dog, throwing money at it won't guarantee it. Okay. But how do we allocate individual rigs to what we all want? We want high performance. Mikey likes it, low cost. And I use something that's very common in the business world. I'm sure most all of you have seen this, whether you've thought about it or not. Quadrant analysis, and compare satisfaction performance at different price points to look at it. Now, I also look at the price variable transformed into a T-score, which is the same as the Sherwood Performance Index. And I look at the performance to price ratio as a measure of bang for the buck. And that's also part of what I'm going to show. And all of us, if you go right back to that last slide, how many times when you go to a ham fest where you see people with, I'm an ICOM guy, I'm a Yaesu guy, I'm a Flex guy, I've got this, and the swag that manufacturers put out there want that symbolism because they want that product identification. Well, I think the jury may be out, but I'm going to show you some surprising results at the major manufacturers and their relationship to performance and satisfaction when you control for price. There's some real winners and those that stand out. And there's some you might think would, but sort of don't. Next slide. All right, you can't read this graph. I know it. The next slide will have one you can read, but I want to illustrate what we're doing. Rod, if you'd kind of put your cursor up there in that upper right quadrant where I've got all those labels. Now, this is the data for each rig, and this is why that's important. When you go from left to right, that's the Sherwood Performance Index. If you're to the right of that red vertical line, you're above the median score on Sherwood's measures. Then on the left is the average eHam. So if you're below that, where you got a lot of those little colored dots and things without labels, then you don't get as much love as the median rig does on eHam that's in Rob's list. If you're to the upper and left where the cursor is right now, then you're a lower performing but highly loved radio. Okay. I'm going to point out a couple of those, at least as these data shows. Now, in the bottom right, and you can't read it, but you will in the next one, I took the quartiles of price. In other words, what's the median price? What's the 25 percentile value? What's the 75 percentile value? So you kind of break out what the objective price point is in 2019 dollars. And that's where the colors and the shapes of those points are. Now we'll go to the next slide and we'll look and see what we find. Okay. These are the optimal performance satisfaction. Rob says they work great. Mikey likes it. And here they are at their various price quartile. All right. So what are we finding here? Well, the top performer is on the bubble for satisfaction. It's in the second quartile for price. So it doesn't get quite the love that the FTDX 101 1D gets, but it's up there, and it actually technically outperforms it by just a smidge, just a skosh. But that FTD, I've got FTDS, that should be an X. I need to fix that. It's much more expensive than the Flex. So you look at the 7851. Now look at a 9. It's up there with some satisfaction. They got Mick Jagger in there saying you can get satisfaction with the Anon. Elecraft, all three of those. So the Flex 6700 is down there too. Well, what's up with Flex here? Well, doesn't have a knob. You get some people don't like the fact it doesn't have a knob. They'll sell you a knob to plug in the USB port, and they'll sell you Maestro, really fancy knob with its own screen. So we're going to explore a little bit of that here in the next slide. But I want you to look at this very standard business analytics procedure. These are those that perform well. Mikey likes it. And here are their different price points. And you can play at different ranges, and their performance is going to be within shouting distance of one another. And hams writ large that weigh in on eHam, they kind of more or less like them. Next slide. Now, this whole thing about get a lot of rig for the money, if you go take the time as I have to read the eHam reviews, that is such a very common thing. So I added a new variable list analysis as I went back through some of it. And as I told you, it's the price performance ratio. It's the Sherwood performance index divided by the T-score version of the price. So if you've got a ratio of 1, that means that rig has median score on Sherwood, median score on price, right in their average. Well, if it goes up, then you're getting more bang for the buck. You get more performance for the price. If you're less, then you're not getting as much performance for price as the median. Next slide. Now, just replicated this and just, want to show you that same quadrant. And we're going to go back to that upper right slide. I just wanted to show you, and I've highlighted a few. Rod, go out there and put that cursor on that Hilberling, lower left. Remember earlier I said on a purely rational price basis, if price would guarantee you the best rig, we'd all buy Hilberling. Well, if you did, your performance to price ratio would be down there about 0.8. You'd be kind of losing some value perhaps. And I've also coded these for actual price quartile, because let's face it, my wife is a consumer finance specialist. Her PhD is in that area, and she's done a whole lot of that and consulted and things like what is a life lost worth? You got run over by a car, so she's one that will tell you get all these percentage off, and you can go bankrupt saving money. so keep in mind, at price point, that performance per price, if it's real expensive, that's still what you got to pay for it. You may be getting a lot of performance per price. So I color coded and put certain indicators. And now some of these beloved rigs like Raycal, I'd love to have a Raycal. I've just had such admiration from reading about them. I've never bought one. Got good friends that have Collins. I've never bought one. I know, George, you've got one that you refurbished or you're in the process of doing it. Not saying they're not great rigs. They just don't perform well in terms of receiving, according to Rob Sherwood. And they're in the highest price. Now, money might buy love, but love can cost an awful lot. That's the point here. Next slide. So now let's look at that upper right-hand quadrant. So when we look at performance to price, I've annotated some of these, and I'll have more. There's another slide now that's going to have more details, but I want to illustrate the idea. Now, notice that Flex and Elecraft are noted in this. They have a very good line of rigs, Elecraft and Flex, that give you performance for the price. Clearly sticks out. So does Anon, that 7000 DLE. It's a player here. Notice that Kenwood 590 SG in data not shown here. When I did this analysis, I have a 590 SG. I've got a real close friend, and that's his sort of main rig. My first rig was the Kenwood TS 830. I'm not loyal to a particular brand. Each has its own value, and I like some Kenwoods. I did notice that in the eHam metric, which is hard to move the needle, that the 590S and the 590SG actually move the needle on eHam. And from my analysis of this, that's a little sidebar tidbit. That SG, they did some things with the G that made a difference. They're both in this analysis. So it's kind of in a sweet spot if you look at the price quadrant in terms of measured performance for the money, and it's at a little bit of a lower price point. But these are those rigs that give you a bang for the buck, and they're liked by the collectivity of hams that say they purchased them, and they're at different price points. So this can help narrow down. If you come into it agnostically, you say, I want one that receives great. I want one that other people haven't found a lot of gotchas in, and so Mikey likes it. And I only got so much to spend, and that so much to spend can vary. So much to spend for one ham might be $10,000. So much to spend for the next ham might be $2,000. So this gives you a winnowing down or a focal point, come down to a set of rigs that on price, collective sentiment about it, and objective dollars, you can hone in on. Let's go to the next one because the story's not over. Now, here is an optimal rig list. Now, note that these are all in the highest quartile of performance to price. So these are all good bang for the buck rigs. And you've got the year it was introduced, the performance to price ratio in the top quartile. Now, realize you may not be able to see that if you're on an iPad or an iPhone. I understand. Pop Rod a note. He'll forward that paper to you. Pop me a note. I'll forward the full manuscript, and it's very readable graphics. It's in a PDF. The Sherwood Performance Index, the average eHam score, introductory price, nominal price, and then the price in 2019, the eHam quartile, and the price in 2019 dollars quartile. And through looking at those, although slightly subjective, there are three groups of these top bang for the buck rigs that I think distinguish themselves. One is the sweet spot. They're all in the top quartile for for performance for price. Keep that in mind. They're in the top eHam quartile. Mikey really likes it. And they're either in the lowest or second quartile in price. So they got that sweet spot characteristics where they're not going to just destroy your bank account for a couple of years on what you've got to spend on an HF rig. They're great value for the performance dollar, if you will, in terms of Sherwood's receiving. And they're in the top quartile for eHam. And as I said, they tend to be a halo effect there, but these are at the top of the top. These include the Elecraft KX2, the Elecraft KS3, the Kenwood TS590SG, the receiver that Rob Sherwood uses frequently. And if you look at some of his talks, he'll say, I looked at this on my IC8600, a very top flight receiver. It's in that ballpark. And lo and behold, the thing that kicked it off for Rob Sherwood, the Drake R4C, those are all in the sweet spot. Now, I will tell you that price at release of the market on the Drake, you can't get one from Drake anymore. So you're buying used. So in a little bit, that's not a real fact, but those fall in terms of the data. The second one's what I call the hot rods. Back in the 50s and 60s, where teenagers would put together hot rods, and some of them still do today. They didn't care about how it looked. They didn't care about having automatic transmission. In fact, they didn't want one with automatic transmission. They didn't even care if they had a muffler on it, as long as the police didn't write them a ticket. They wanted performance and, don't want to break the bank on it, perhaps. So all top quartile of performance for price. They're second in the eHam satisfaction, and they're in the lowest two quartiles. They're below the median value on price. The Flex 6600M, and then its version without the knob. I have that rig. I started with a Flex 3000, and I have the 6400 now, and the KX3. The third group are what I call the contenders. Who was that said, I could have been a contender? I forget which movie that was in. Now, these are top quartile performance price ratio. They get a lot of love. They're in the top eHam, but they're in that third quartile of what they cost. They cost a little more money. So you got performance for the dollar, but it costs you more to buy it. So keep in mind, those are kind of two different things. One's relative and one's absolute. FTDX 101D, the Kenwood TS890S is compared to that 590SG. They're all in the performance to price. These other characteristics kick in and distinguish them differently. And the Apache Anon 7000 DLE. These other rigs, my beloved Perseus SDR, the best receiver I've ever had was that Perseus with a Wellbrook 1530 S Plus rig from England. That's now been succeeded by some other SDRs. Love the Perseus. Got me into SDR about 11 years ago. I will not tell you what I paid for it. Far too much money by today's standard. And if you look at these others, they're all high PPR rigs. They just don't have kind of that coalescence to distinguish themselves in terms of group. A little bit subjective. I plan to have these data on one of my websites, foxmikehotel.com. I got to do some updates to that site, got a new PHP thing I've got to do. That's going to force me to change the theme I use. Give me about a month. I'll have that table out there. I'm going to do it so you can go sort it on a lot of different columns, and you can mix and match and analyze these data I've put together on your own. And so give me about 30 days to get that done. I hope to do it before then. Next slide. Now, let's then look at this thing to try to summarize. How much effect does price have on performance and satisfaction? There's really an inconsistent pattern. If you went back to that first set of tables when I asked you to look at them, the top 10 on price, the lowest 10 on price, top 10 on performance, lowest 10, top 10 on satisfaction, lowest. If money guaranteed it, you see those names carry through the whole analysis, wouldn't you? You didn't see all of them do that. You saw a few of them. Now, so a random high price rig does not guarantee measured receive performance that's good or collective satisfaction. Can we put a finer point on this? Yes, we can. Some of you remember linear regression from a calculus class, rise over run, if you remember a high school class, the slope. Some of you may know a great deal about it, but I did a linear regression model that included the performance index as the dependent variable and the satisfaction score as the dependent variable, separate models. I've got the price of the rig in 2019 dollars. I got binary variables. We call them dummy variables. It's 1 if it's pre-70s, 0 otherwise, and so on. The reference group is the 2010 and beyond. So when it was released to the market, and whether it's from one of the major manufacturers, the big three of ICOM, Yaesu, and Kenwood, but the Johnny-come-latelys who seem to score well, Flex and Elecraft. And just for the satisfaction variable. Now, I had some people say, well, there's some small number of reviews. As a statistician, you need to look at that. And I would concur because I taught asymptotic relative efficiency and how many sample do you have to have the variance of the error smooth out. So yeah, I know all about that. So that concerned me. Let me tell you what I found out. I looked at that extensively. And yes, a small number of reviews would suggest unreliability. But that unreliability appears to be random. What do I mean by that? Small number of reviews can result in a high eHam score or a low eHam score. So, yep, there's some with a small number of reviews, but they bounce around. They don't give a bias, as we might call it in statistics, toward either a halo or a negative one. Now, but I put the number of eHam reviews in the model on the satisfaction to try to control for that. And we'll see if it has an effect. Next slide. All right, now this is the summary. And what, Rod, if you do is that beta coefficient under the rig performance, where it says B and then beta. I want to focus on that column because I'll tell you what that tells us. A beta can typically range from 0 to 1, either in a positive or negative way. If it's negative, that means it has an inverse relationship. So as you go up on one thing, you go down on the other. It can go over 1, and it's a sign that you need to change your oil very quickly because your engine is blowing up. That is, you've got a severe statistical problem. So for statisticians out there, I taught this for a long, long time. Now, look at the overall equation for those betas, that little R squared down there. That's the variance that performance on the Sherwood index has in common with all of these predictors. So that's 0.688. That's about 0.69, roughly 2/3. So 2/3 of all of the differences on the Sherwood Performance Index can be associated with price, when it was released, who released it in terms of manufacture. Think about that for a moment. That explains not everything, but a fair amount. I had a reader say, you need to account for Moore's Law. Well, Moore's Law says the number of transistors that can be put in a chip doubles, and you go on and on. Okay, that means you got better chips that can process more information. Some then extrapolate that to CPUs, and CPUs get better and faster, and so on and so on. But when you look at the performance index, what you find in those trends that it didn't kick off until 2000 or 2010. It didn't follow that geometric progression of what Moore's Law would say. Some of my electrical engineering, computer engineering friends say Moore's Law doesn't hold any longer, but I'm going to leave that debate for someone else. Fact is, these data in terms of realized performance don't follow Moore's Law. I think there's a reason. I think when you design a rig, and they put certain chips in it. Some of you out there may be in the industry and can correct me if I'm wrong. There's a lot of R&D that goes into designing that board that chip will do certain things, instruction sets. So just because you can get a faster chip, doesn't mean you're going to yank it out and replace the same model radio with a newer, faster chip. What you typically do is like what happened with the 590S. You come out with a new model that you've redesigned, at least part of it, enough to give it a whole different rig name like the SG. So I took that comment as a valid comment. I don't see anything that says Moore's Law helps explain this. Anyway, 2/3 of difference. Now, let's look at the beta coefficient for price. No, previous slide. But
Sorry.
beta coefficient for price, it's 0.341 for price under performance index. I'm trying to point, Rod. Sorry, I'm used to touch screens. It's over in that rig performance index column, and it says rig price, and it's 0.341. 0.341 in there you go. Like a fly swatter trying to hit a fly. All right, so price is related to better receive performance. That thing could be 0.9, couldn't it? It could be 0.8. Yeah, price makes a difference. The surprising thing is that why doesn't it make a bigger difference? If you were released before 1970, that makes just as big a difference as the adjusted inflation price. 0.326, more or less. And so if you go on down there, you see that the decade that you were released in has a consistently declining effect that represents that graph where on the Sherwood Performance Index, it just took off after 2000. So in other words, on the Sherwood Performance Index, we look at the B column here. That's a raw metric. Pre-1970, you were 25 points down on the Sherwood Index, even with price control, if you were released in the 1970s. So price of the rig, even though some premium rigs were released later, doesn't really account for the improvements. It wasn't just that take my money, more money, better rig. No. The engineering got better because we had better parts and better circuits and so on. Now, does who released it make a difference? Look at the first manufacturer. Now, these are Elecraft, Flex, ICOM, Kenwood, and Yaesu relative to everybody else. I don't want to call them no name. I don't mean that. I just mean everybody else. So with price control, and regardless of when it's released, Elecraft had 17 points better performance than everybody else. Well, Elecraft wasn't around in 1970. It was what we call a Johnny come lately. It came in, I believe, after 2000. So it captures the benefits of the marketplace. Flex is about 12 points better. Well, it's a Johnny come lately. It captured the better technology. But look at the traditional big three. You see that NS beside them? Not significant. You may be an ICOM guy, Yaesu guy, Kenwood guy. I got all three hats in my closet, okay? But on Sherwood Performance, when you control for price and what decade, coming from that major manufacturer doesn't make any difference. That's just kind of random. Okay, now let's go over satisfaction. Previous slide. I'm sorry. We're going to look at a boring table of numbers on the previous slide for just one more minute because it's really important here to show what's going on. Its R square is 0.199, about 2. So about 20% of the differences in average eHam is related to all these variables, whereas 2/3 for performance. Big difference. And look at the effect on the beta for price, 0.289. It was 341 for Sherwood Performance. So price has a smaller effect on satisfaction. So no wonder there's some people out there cursing up a storm at when they threw money at it. They may have gotten one, didn't guarantee satisfaction, and may not have guaranteed performance. But then when you go down that column of betas on satisfaction, you really don't have any other significant factors. Yeah, that Yesu effect is there, but it's not significant. So money does buy a little bit of improvement in average satisfaction, just not much. I think there's a reason for it, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Now, Rod, let's go to that next slide where we look at a picture rather than a table of numbers. Here is a graph of the average performance to price ratio by the decade it was introduced. And I've looked at it for the major manufacturers and everybody else lumped into other. That solid black line that's solid is the others. You can see that Flex and Elecraft, they entered in the 2000s. Wow, they began ahead of everybody else and have only gotten better in terms of the Sherwood index relative to the price. Now look at Kenwood. It started out with a PPR that was down below 0.9 back in the 70s. And they've meandered up slightly into third place, followed by Yesu and eHam. Now remember, this is performance on Sherwood's bench, the composite, to the price recommended to the marketplace. I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe eHam pioneered the premium rig concept. And as we saw in the performance to price, even for Kenwood, that 590 SG is in that sweet spot. The much more expensive 890 and really more expensive 990. Yeah, people like them, but they don't get performance, that much more performance relative to the dollar. I'm going to come back to that in my punchline for the talk. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. All rigs got better performance for price over time. Okay? All of them got better, but some of them entered best and continued to get better, and they stand out. And those are Elecraft and Flex. Okay? Next slide. When we look at satisfaction in the next slide, all that looks neat, doesn't it? It's just random fluctuation. That's all it is. It's just random fluctuation. So yeah, guess who's that icon down at the bottom? That's that poor R72 that popped out in the data. But statistically, this is just fluctuations, and there's not a whole lot of difference between, in terms of satisfaction. Next slide. Now, trying to make some conclusions. Now, I found no study that's got this kind of data. So the results are new. It's unique, and it gives us an opportunity to investigate what Steve Ford of the ARL in that little pamphlet asked. How do you know which rig is best without throwing away money? Let me state this as clearly as I can. Best is idiosyncratic to some degree to the individual ham. And that slide I just showed you, the trends in eHam satisfaction, while they were related a little bit to the price paid. Now, is that a justification? I spent all this money. I got to love it. I don't know. No way to tell. But what is best? I look to the rig narrative. And inevitably, what might be the best rigs on Rob Sherwood's bench, according to him, is that FTDX 101. When I put all his measurements together, it's the Flex 400M, I think. I remember. It's one of the Flexes. Immediately, you'll get people right in. They hate it. So you might even say that person's an idiot. They don't know what they're talking about. And some of them really are, because they kind of reveal they don't know things they're criticizing about, and they're just not, holistically valid. But I want to remind you of something. Their particularistic reason, I didn't like the packaging, whatever, it's valid to them. It's valid to them. So when you go to ask, does Mikey likes it? Yeah, listening to Mikey it's kind of important. We do that for a lot of stuff. We do that in voting behavior. We do it in a whole lot of things. You kind of touch base with people who are guideposts for you. But what about to you? When the other ham doesn't like it, it's important to figure out why. Why don't they like it? And you have to consider what's best for you. I want to witness one of the biggest impacts in anybody who does RF measurements. Then it's the nano VNA, about $50. There's a whole bunch of them out there. I've seen so many of my ham friends who didn't have a workbench. They wanted an antenna analyzer. They saw this thing for $50 and they can't figure out how to use it. And they get very frustrated with it, and they either throw it away or give it away. So what they wanted was an appliance we call an antenna analyzer that you still have to understand how to use, but you can push a few buttons and you get kind of a set readout of what you want. Whereas that $50 nano VNA is an attempt at a little bit of a vector-based analyzer that gives you a little bit of RF laboratory capability. So that might be a poor analogy, but I think it's one that price can be an illusion. So satisfaction can be as well. What's best for you? I hope these results help you narrow down the scope of rigs to consider. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to point out what I think is missing. Now, price is related to better performance and satisfaction. The big surprise is, why isn't it related in a stronger way? Everything we say to each other, we think it would have a stronger relationship. But we're getting the best receivers that we've ever gotten, and it's not even close. Now, here's what I think is missing from the average eHam data, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to solve it in my future research after I web scrape everything and do some natural language processing sentiment analysis on it. Price is only moderately related, but what about the features? What about the ergonomics? You know, that nano VNA, what the biggest complaint is when you read it? I can't read the darn thing. Well, it's very small and it's only $50. Well, we do the same thing with radios. Yaesu should have put a color display on that FT891 along with an ATU. Well, and that'd have been over $1,000 if they'd done that. Plus your battery life would go down. Everybody got upset because the receive current draw is over an amp on receive only. So when you think about what people want and what their expectations are, feature set is got to be one of the missing things that I don't have here. And I thought about, okay, maybe I can kind of go back and get that. Well, think about it. We have new things such as DSP audio processing that didn't exist in Collins' era. I could spend some time and go through and do some kind of laundry list. I could ask you to tell me what your important features are, and we could come up with some sort of list. Well, the same thing can be, the DSP can be in IF. It can be done elsewhere. So going back and creating those data, I think would be practically impossible. Ergonomics. Yeah, I wear glasses. Yeah, I can't see some fine print, some small print. As hams, the corpus of hams seems to be getting older, I suspect Mikey can't read them either. There are some other ergonomics depending upon how you're going to use a rig. I have an ICOM 7300. I do not take that out into the field. I use an FT450D. I've got a Yaesu FT857D. Those are in 2 go boxes, and I've got an 891 in a grab and go bag, and I got a couple of Zygoos. I don't like to get rigs that I think are that are house cats, I don't like to send them outdoors. That's me. That may not be you. So even ergonomics, it's ergonomics relative to what? So I don't directly observe these here. I want to openly admit, I think those have a lot to do with the eHam satisfaction scores and the fact that it doesn't matter when it was released. It matters a little bit what the price was, but it doesn't really matter who released it, the major manufacturers. So when you look at it though, the folks that say, I'm a Kenwood guy, I love that Kenwood audio, and you ain't gonna ever take that away from me. Great. But it doesn't affect overall eHam satisfaction scores. That ICOM guy or gal can be the same way, and so can Yaesu, and so can Anon and anybody else. So when you look at it overall, there just isn't any evidence available in this study so that major manufacturer impacts are there. The sole exception is in Receive Performance, Elecraft, and Flex. They came into the marketplace when that revolution was happening, as we saw in the trend chart. And that's it for major manufacturers. They ought to be proud of that because, boy, it shows. Now, I put out these three things: sweet spot, hot rods, and contenders are all high performing relative to their introductory price. They stand out for different reasons. You need to evaluate those things based on your own preferences and priority. Next slide. And it'll be on foxmicheltel.com. I can send you the longer one. It's always caveat emptor when you put down your money. I hope this helps you get the most for the least and what Mikey thinks about it and that sort of thing. National Contesting Journal is putting it out. Let me just tell you, if you get, as a member of ARL, you get that free digitally. Their graphics are horrible. I've been trying to work with them. I've started journals. I've done everything from typesetting on a Linustronic back in the day. And there's a problem with PageSuite in United Kingdom, and they need to solve that problem. And so far, they haven't. And their print version is black and white. And the first part one is in the current print NCJ, but I'll be happy. I'm going to put that on a website so you can get clear graphics. And I don't mean to pound on them. They got a problem, and I hope they fix it, and I hope they'll get that worked out. So thank you for listening on a Saturday morning. I'm sure glad it's remote because we could have fist fights in the kitchen over rigs. So I'll entertain any and all questions and suggestions. And if there's errors and things you see, I'm like, who's that guy ran for president? I'm all ears.
Yep,
Guy from Texas. Go. Yeah. So.
Hey, thank you, Frank. That was really great. Any questions there from the crew?
Yes. I'd like to offer some comment.
Go for it.
Okay. So Frank, first of all, thanks very much for the work you did. That's an amazing collection of data that you've analyzed. And
thank you.
Having done work like that, I know how time consuming it is. I wanted to try and offer a summary of my takeaways from your presentation. So the higher performing radios are pretty much all SDR based, and they've come along through the innovations of digital signal processing. The top performers in that realm are the newcomers, and I can see them being innovative in how they go about doing things and getting increased performance because they have no albatross they're dragging along behind them. Whereas the typical big three are still trying to use innovations they've had in the past and moving them forward and incorporating them into the new technology.
In total agreement with your comment. Could not be in more agreement.
The other thing was that based on what you analyzed, the eHam reviews were more subjective reviews.
Without a doubt.
Right. And the what I found in my past history, I spent 32 years in the high tech industry doing all kinds of crap. But user interfaces uh, drive people's opinions of the product, not necessarily the functionality or the performance. And the newer equipment has the ability to put big screens on, which improves the UI and takes some of the multifunction buttons and knobs and brings them up to all to the same level of the UI. So the products that have access, video or UI access on a big screen, they all rated higher. And they're very subjective. Some people like the arrangement, some people don't. It's how does your mind work? That's the radio that's going to work best for you. Thank you.
Listen, Rod, you know me. You know I have a crazy sense of humor. So I'm going to set this up. So I've got a single hand gesture to respond to you with.
Yeah, very good.
Thumbs up. And let me comment on that. I think you're spot on. Those of you remember the word processing software WordPerfect that came out of Provo, Utah. They may still be around. I don't know. I did a lot of usability tests for them. In fact, my research center at Mississippi State came very close to signing a contract to be their national usability center. And we were actually going to spin that off as a national center for a lot of different software companies. You have touched on something that is incredibly valid, in my opinion. As a social scientist, I've done a lot of related stuff, from how fruit juices are packaged and put on grocery stores. There was a test group that just blew Welch's off the Kroger grocery store shelves, for example. And it's how they packaged it and that sort of thing. So your point is extremely valid, but the message, I think, and I would totally concur, is that communicating this out to the rank and file, I hope in a small way, this being published in NCJ, but Scott Wright was the editor when it was accepted, communicate some of that, on the subjective side, money isn't the driving force, and measured performance doesn't seem to be the driving force. What you just talked about, I captured it with feature set and ergonomics. And, we can talk about what terms are good. And to help underscore your point, what's the biggest criticism of the ICOM 7300? Doggone it, they should have put a VGA port down there. I can put it on my big screen. They want me to buy that more expensive model. Exactly what you said. Bigger screen type thing. Then you got Win for ICOM. I think that's the name of a software program that will get that feed and then reproduce a waterfall on it. I think you're subtly getting at what I think is one of the fundamental changes in how we relate to our radios. My first experience with shortwave was I was raised by my grandmother, and she had an old RCA piece of furniture. And remember that little winking eye tube, it would do something. And I think RCA they developed it. I don't know if they patented it or not. And, but when you tuned it in, it'd wink at you. Think about that interface to an S meter, to one frequency on the dial, to where suddenly you get a waterfall. The first person I ever saw do that was Bob Groves of Monitoring Times and Grove Enterprises. He monitored the shortwave bands with a HP spectrum analyzer. He knew the broadcast bands well enough to know when that little blip shouldn't be there, or was new, or was down from what it typically was. But that whole notion of that waterfall, seeing more than one frequency, is a subtlety. One day the anthropologists will talk about this, I'm convinced, of us seeing that. I think your point captures it. So what does that do for manufacturers? Those that are legacy, just like in the days, in the 80s, I started a journal with Dave Garson. I was on the faculty at NC State called the Social Science Microcomputer Review. It's now just the Social Science Computer Review, and Sage Publishers out in California is the publisher, still in business. I was flying all over the country to colleges and universities talking about what personal computers meant for them. And I'll never, ever forget an email I got from Peter Joftis, who was one of the IT guys at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, big IBM place, big iron. Peter said, you know, Frank, I hope one day that we're like a lot of those smaller schools that you're going around talking to, because I had gone up there and talked. He said, we can't afford to buy out our IBM contract and move. Take that same logic with the little schools, if you will, that is, they don't have that legacy investment, could adopt PCs, and they did, and they moved quicker. What you said, I think, is spot on for the big three out of Japan, is their R&D, and you make a widget, it works, it sells, it's in a few rigs. What does it take corporate-wise to move away from it? And so, you know, there are some parallels here for amateur radio in rig design and development that you have touched on, and I think is part of what explains the eHam. I'll end with this comment. Yeah, they're very subjective, and they got the money to make them valid. People use eHam to make purchases on. So whether they're valid or terribly subjective from an engineer's point of view or not, someone said that a user interface is just what the engineer designing it likes, not necessarily what the customer likes. Anyway, I'll stop with it. Great point.
Good.
Hey, very good. Thank you so much, Frank. I appreciate it. I think we've had a bit of a record recording on here, but it was definitely dense and full of facts. So I really appreciate your time going on this. I do have to get us to move on with the day. I'm going to take a couple of last questions if we need to, but with this, I'm going to end the recording so that we don't pass the 2-hour mark. And I'll put in a small plug for the Women's Hockey League, which has got a game on in the bubble, which my daughters are dragging me towards. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to end the recording here, and I will say thank you so much.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks.
Okay.